Hi everyone! In this video we're going to go over proteins. So we'll talk a little bit about the size of proteins and then we'll also talk about important proteins and types of proteins. So in this table we have the molecular weights of some common proteins, and remember that when we define a protein, that means that it has more than 50 amino acids. So insulin, for example, has 51 amino acid residues in its structure, so it is considered a protein and not a polypeptide anymore. There are some other proteins listed here as well, and you can see that you can have thousands of amino acid residues in a protein. So the molecular weight is going to increase the more amino acid residues that are present in the protein. So don't worry too much about the proteins listed here. We'll talk about some special proteins in a bit. So proteins in general are extremely large polymers. They have, again, very large molecular weights relative to, for instance, a single amino acid. They're too large to pass through cell membranes, although remember when we talked about cell membranes, we said that proteins can exist in a cell membrane and help transport small ions or even really small molecules through to the interior of the cell, but also back out to the exterior of the cell. Now, a typical human cell will contain 9,000 different proteins. That's a lot of proteins. And the human body contains about 100,000 different proteins. So it's really amazing to think that all of these different proteins have different functions, and yet somehow they're all working together to help us function. So the human body is really amazing in that it somehow functions even though there's all of these different proteins who all have different functions. Now, proteins will take the form of Zwitter ions because, again, they're made up of amino acids. They do have a characteristic isoelectric point, so the point at which the net charge is 0. And because they're made up of amino acids, they can behave as buffers in solution. So remember, amino acids can behave as buffers, so it follows that proteins can behave as buffers. So let's talk about different types of proteins, and I'll give an example with each type. So the first type of protein is a catalytic protein. So these function as enzymes. And remember, in the next chapter, chapter 20, we're going to discuss enzymes in more detail. But one example of an enzyme is called lactate dehydrogenase. So this is going to oxidize lactic acid. So often the name of an enzyme kind of tells you what it does. So lactate is the molecule that lactate dehydrogenase can create. And dehydrogenase tells us that we're essentially losing hydrogen, so we're oxidizing. Now, lactic acid is a molecule that can build up during intense exercise, so this protein or enzyme can help break that down. Structural proteins form the structural materials of the skeleton or other components of the body. So for example, collagen is a structural protein, and this is important for skin, bone, muscles, and tendons. So you might have heard of collagen in things like lotions, especially face lotions, and you know, it's always advertised that they can help bring back your collagen and make your skin smooth. So as we age, collagen does decrease, or the, I guess, flexibility of collagen. So That's why you can start to show some wrinkles over time. But off to the side, I have a picture of the structure of collagen, and you can see it just looks kind of like a big long thread or rope structure. And then if you zoom in, you can see all the different amino acids and other molecules that are connected together to create this structure. The next type of protein is called a storage protein. So these proteins can store small molecules or ions that the body can use later on. One example is casein, a protein found in milk. And this protein provides all of the necessary amino acids that the body needs. Of course, this can be difficult if you can't digest milk or you have dairy intolerance. But there are other proteins as well that can provide the necessary nutrients that you need. Protective proteins are, for instance, antibodies, and this is a substance that helps protect the body from invasion by viruses, bacteria, other foreign substances, as well as blood clotting. So this is very relevant because recently the COVID vaccine came out, and we've probably all been getting, hopefully, vaccinated if you can. So the antibodies in the picture here kind of have the shape of a Y. So they've got these two sort of ends that attach to a virus, and they basically tell your body how to attack foreign bodies or viruses in the future. So vaccines, for instance, can help train your body how to fight off a virus. Now, of course, the effectiveness can wear off over time, but we also naturally produce antibodies as well. Vaccines just kind of give us that extra boost so that we don't necessarily get sick in the first place. Regulatory proteins are responsible for hormone regulation. So one example is the protein insulin, and this regulates glucose metabolism. So this is a key protein. If someone has diabetes, for instance, they might need insulin. And actually, you'll notice I did post some links with each picture, so you can always go and read more about these if you are interested in them. The next type of protein is a nerve impulse transmission protein. So that's a very long name, but these are proteins that act as receptors of small molecules. So these will pass between gaps that separate nerve cells. So one example is the protein rhodopsin, and these are found in the retina of the eye. So you can see a picture of the structure of rhodopsin off to the side. The next type, movement proteins, are muscle proteins. One example is the protein actin. Actin are thin filaments in muscle fiber. So these, again, just look kind of like collagen almost. They look like ropes or threads. Transport proteins are proteins that bind and transport small molecules and ions throughout the body. So one example is hemoglobin, which is shown down below. And this will transport oxygen in the blood. And we'll talk a little bit more about hemoglobin later on. Hemoglobin is actually made up of 4 different pieces. So you can see those 4 different pieces there. And we'll talk more about that structure later as well. But what happens here is that each of those different pieces contains what's called a heme group. And heme contains iron in the middle. So that's why blood can taste or smell like iron. So like if you've ever bit your tongue and it bleeds, you might taste a little bit of iron. But iron is what binds oxygen, and then hemoglobin can then transport up to 4 molecules of oxygen through your blood. Now, um, if you've ever wondered why you have a carbon monoxide detector in your uh, place of residence, carbon monoxide is very similar to oxygen molecules, and it can actually replace oxygen in hemoglobin, and you can end up with carbon monoxide poisoning. So it's really important to have a detector in your place of residence so that you know if there's too much carbon monoxide in your room or your house or apartment, for instance. That way you can avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, so those were all of the different types of proteins. So earlier we said that there were about 100,000 different proteins in the human body. And you can see why, because there's so many different functions that proteins can perform. We have muscle proteins, we have transport, nerve function proteins, all sorts. So they're all doing different jobs to keep our bodies functioning as best as possible. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about protein shapes as well. So fibrous proteins are long, rod-shaped or string-like molecules, and they intertwine to form fibers. So one example that we saw was collagen, and that did look like a rope or a thread or a string. Others are called elastin and keratin, and there's many more as well. There's also globular proteins, and those are spherical shaped proteins, and they can form stable suspensions in water, almost kind of like oil in water a little bit. Or they're very water soluble. So one example is hemoglobin, which we just saw, and another is enzymes, which we'll talk more about in the next chapter. So you can kind of see generic shapes down below. So we've got our fibrous protein there. It almost looks like a piece of licorice where you've got the different threads kind of winding around each other. And then we've got our globular protein. So there's a hydrophobic region which is in the middle away from water. And then you have your hydrophilic groups kind of poking out towards the aqueous region, so the water region. And then there's also protein composition. So we have simple proteins and conjugated proteins. So simple proteins contain only amino acid residues. So, they don't have anything else in them. But then there's conjugated proteins that contain, of course, amino acid residues, but they also contain other components. So down below, we again have hemoglobin. And I mentioned earlier that we have these 4 different pieces of hemoglobin that are kind of connected together. And each one of those pieces has a heme group that can then bind to oxygen. So the heme group is what's called a prosthetic group, or just, another organic or inorganic component. So some other examples of conjugated proteins are nucleoproteins. These are nucleic acids. And this will become important when we talk about DNA and RNA. Lipoproteins, which are lipids. We've talked about lipids before. Glycoproteins, which contain carbohydrates, and we've talked about carbohydrates before. Phosphoproteins contain phosphate groups. So we mentioned casein in milk. Hemoproteins contain heme, so that's like hemoglobin, for instance. And then metalloproteins will contain a metal like iron or zinc. So these are just some more examples of proteins that contain a prosthetic group. All right, so actually I think we'll stop there for this lecture. Now I would like you to kind of generally know the different types of proteins we talked about, like storage proteins or muscle proteins, etc. And then you don't necessarily have to memorize what each protein does. There are so many proteins, that would be a lot to ask of you. But I might ask you some questions about enzymes later on. So just keep that in mind. Next time, we're going to talk about how proteins form their structure. So there's a primary, secondary, tertiary, and a quaternary structure potentially for different proteins. So we'll talk about those next time.